Hello, my name is Andrey Pavlov. I'm a senior lecturer here at the School of Management. In the studio with me I've got Dr. Toby Thompson, and we're looking at this book, Heidegger and Executive Education, The Management of Time, which was published in the series called The New Directions in the Philosophy of Education. So we're looking at the philosophy of education here. And Toby, I do want to talk a little bit about the book as well. But can I just start by asking, what's your background here? Where are you coming from?
Well, I work in the School of Management at Cranfield University, and specifically the Cranfield Executive Development. So I'm looking at executive development, executive education, executive training. My background is in philosophy. So I was a Zen Buddhist monk for several years. Before that, I studied philosophy at university as an undergraduate, and then did a master's in philosophy of management education or management learning. That was at Lancaster. And then did a PhD in philosophy and executive education, specifically with Martin Heidegger, which I'm sure you're going to come on to.
Absolutely.
And how Heidegger slams into and how it can be useful for understanding executive education. So that philosophy and executive education has gone together forever, as far as I'm concerned.
So you're the perfect person to look at an issue like
perfect,
this.
I'm not sure about perfect, but a useful crowbar into looking at something new, which hasn't been looked at a lot, I would say.
Perfect. And what drove you to look at executive education in such a fundamental way?
I think we say in executive education that we're going to help you be a better executive, be a better manager, to work inside corporations better, to carry out the orders of the company better, to be a better person. And yet we see in the world not betterness. We see whales eating plastic bags. We see tensions in global conflicts. We see capitalism in trouble. We see the delinquencies of capitalism. And we don't see too much in the way of the questioning of that ideology in executive education. So I thought it was worth looking at afresh.
But why philosophy? What does philosophical analysis do here that other forms of inquiry, other forms of investigation can't?
Valid question. I'm a philosopher, so I have to think a little bit as to why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Absolutely.
I think when you're asking fundamental questions, when you're asking about the very basis of why something exists and what it means to be an educator of executives, then I think you have to call on some pretty uncommon tools which allow you to ask fundamental questions. And for me, philosophy asks fundamental questions, such as what does it mean to be? Why are you spending the time on doing what you're doing, and what is the time that you are spending doing what you're doing? That's the toolkit that I think gets at the very heart of why we do pretty much anything.
So it's the power of the fundamental questioning of the assumptions behind what we're doing. That's what philosophy gives us.
It is, and it's also the ability to say, or to defend yourself against questions such as, well, that doesn't really matter, does it? Or why are you spending so much time looking at that? Surely we can move on. Actually, the moving on is the reversing back into these fundamental questions. And it's allowing you, or it's giving you a remit to say, I'm a philosopher, I can ask these questions. And it's uncommon in as much as executive education at the moment doesn't generally ask those deep sort of questions about why it does what it does.
Right. So you look at executive education through the analytical power of philosophy, and you see what?
Well, if philosophers are watching, then I'm from the continental tradition, so less analytic, but I see people not asking these questions, the fundamental questions that I'm talking about, and I see a lack as a result of that. So first of all, I look at something called, that I call anyway, the order execution cognate.
The order execution cognate.
The order execution cognate. A cognate is two things that are joined together. And sometimes they're joined together so well that you cannot see the join, and you cannot see that a cognate is composed of two things. You generally see it as one thing.
Right.
So my interpretation of what I see in executive education is that the cognate I'm talking about is order and execution. These are my two components of the cognate.
Hence the executive education, right?
Hence executive education.
Right.
Execution, being an executive, means that you carry out orders. So if you're a musical executant, you carry out the orders, in quotes, of the composer.
Right.
That's a very loose metaphor, and there's more that you can talk about that. If you're an executor of a will, you carry out the orders of the deceased in the will. If you're an artist, you're an executant, you carry out an order or an inspiration, you could say, and this is where you have to question both sides of the equation of the cognate. your interpretation of something. Yeah, the executive branch of government carries out the orders of the legislature. And if you're an executive inside of a corporate, you carry out the orders of the corporate to make more money, to be more profitable.
And what does your analysis of this cognate tell you?
It tells me that in executive education at the moment, we don't look at the order. We generally run from order to execution straight away. We run right the way through. We don't see them as a cognate. And stopping to see what the orders are that we are executing is a useful part of education. If education is about relativizing knowledge, and by relativizing I mean, well, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this. And if execution is the carrying out of orders, then basically from a syllogistic point of view, and syllogism is a form of logic, executive education is the relativizing of the orders. That's the syllogism that one carries through onto the other.
So what you're doing is you're breaking this apart. You're breaking this cognate apart, and you're saying there are actually two things within it.
I'm putting a crowbar between the two and prizing them apart, and doing quite a bit of splintering damage as a result of that.
And you're using Martin Heidegger's philosophy to do this.
So Heidegger, yes, Heidegger is a very difficult philosopher. If you've heard of him, first thing you'll have heard of him is he's notoriously difficult to understand. But he looks at the fundamental question of being. What does it mean to be? And he says what it means to be is our time, our notion of time. So being and time for him are kind of cognates in that regard. So I'm using his notion of time to break apart these two things, the order and the execution, to say, well, why do we do what we do? What are the orders that we are executing? And why do we think that one naturally follows on from the other? There's a false necessity, I'm saying, and that's a phrase from Roberto Mangabeira Unger, a false necessity of carrying out an order. You can actually question the order. And so time is a fundamental aspect of that questioning.
So if we use time and if we use Heidegger's philosophical apparatus, so to speak, to do this, what do we see there?
He talks about some really uncomfortable things. He talks about death, which we don't like to talk about. He talks about anxiety, which we like to skip over. And he talks about some really mundane things like boredom. Those are, to give three examples, and I talk about those examples in the book, those are three examples that I think are fantastically relevant to us as executives. We are facing our own death, our own mortality. We are anxious an awful lot of the time. And frankly, dare I say it, we're bored a lot of the time. So these are very amenable subjects and topics for an executive, frankly anyone, to consider why they exist and what their being means. So looking at boredom, anxiety and death, which helpfully spell out bad,
right.
Looking at the bad is actually a useful way to drive that crowbar in, just to give a pause, a moment of pause, to say, what does it mean to order, to carry out the order? And what do I mean by order? Do I mean the corporate order? Do I mean the social order? Do I mean the institutional order, the ideology in which we're operating within? So it's all of those things. So the bad is something that readily we have in front of us.
And what's the role of the bad in doing this? What's the reason we're doing this? What's the reason you're recommending doing this?
It's to give ourselves the moment of pause. And I suppose by ourselves I mean principally executive educators, people like you. You're educating executives as well, as am I. And it's to give ourselves a reason to stop, to say it's okay for me to think for a second about why I do what I do. So I'm in the middle of my career, and often the executives that we work with are in the middle of their careers, and possibly towards the end of their careers for that matter. They're anxious about what it is that they do. They're anxious about their impact that they have on the organization, within society conceivably. They are conscious of their death, and if they're not, that consciousness is somewhere in there. So they're thinking, I need to make an impact because I'm going to be an executive for not much longer. And they've possibly reached a point in their executive lives or their midlife crises, and it comes down to that sometimes, where they are profoundly bored with what it is that they're doing. They shouldn't be doing what they're doing. They want to be doing something else. We, and I say they, I'm as much an executive as you are. We are carrying out orders as well. And so the reason to dwell a little bit longer than you want to on something like the bad is to give yourself a reason to think. Well, if you're in executive education, you have a stay of education, you have a stay of execution, in fact. Come to Cranfield on a short course, or come online, because I teach online courses, and start thinking about some of these things. You can, of course, start thinking about how to be a better logistician or a strategist or a financier or an HR specialist. But here you've been given an opportunity to stop for a little bit. Think about something a little bit deeper than just logisticians and financiers and HRs. And this is the opportunity that the book gives you.
Right, and in the book you talk about turning to the progressive practice of executive education, or you call for executive education to be reconceived and practiced anew. So what would it look like then in an executive education session? What are we talking about here?
No one denies that our being makes the most sense in doing what we do. So you clearly, if you're a financier, you need to carry out being a financier. That goes without saying. I'm not saying you shouldn't be a financier. And I'm not saying you should be navel-gazing all your time. But to be a better leader and to be operating in what we call a VUCA environment, the volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world that we live in at the moment, and frankly forever, you need to ask bigger questions. So I think part of education is looking at that order, and for me that's progressive. For business schools and educational institutions to look at something as big as the order that we're operating under, that's quite scary. That's quite scary for the institution. Well, I can't be thinking about that then, or I can't get too political about that, or religious about that, or philosophical about that. That's not my job. Actually, as an educator, I think it is your job. So that for me is progressive. If you're looking to stop whales chomping on plastic that we've seen in the media recently, if you're looking at reducing some of the delinquencies that we see in capitalism, the inequalities that we see, the rise and ineluctable, relentless push of technology. If you want to ask about these and dwell a little bit longer on what a solution might be for you as an individual, then that's quite progressive, distinct from making you a better HR person or a marketeer or a financier.
So becoming more than just a professional.
What is professional? When you profess something, you're putting forward a view. Why not consider the other areas, the other ideologies, the other ways of looking at the world before you commit to professing something? So professional for me, and educating a professional, and let's face it, executive education is a professional education as much as legal and medical, that education requires, it's almost incumbent upon us as educators, you and me, our duty, to invite our executives to pause a little longer than they would normally. And that's what I'm offering. So time, do you have time to pause? I think you should, and I think we should make time for people to pause.
Dr. Toby Thompson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching.